So on to round one. Our motion is cutting the Pentagon's budget is a gift to our enemies. And up to speak first for the motion, Andrew Krepinevich, president of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. He has served in the Department of Defense's Office of Net Assessment and on the personal staff of 3 secretaries of defense. He gets 6 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Krepinevich.
Thank you, John, and on behalf of my partner, Tom Donnelly, also like to thank the Intelligence Squared U.S. Institute and the McCain Institute for sponsoring this debate, and also compliment our worthy adversaries without whom we could not have a debate here tonight. Tom and I, in terms of this proposition, believe that further cuts in our defenses will encourage our adversaries and at the same time increase the risks to our security, our economic well-being, and the security and economic well-being of our allies and partners around the world. In terms of the overall perspective, let's take a look at this, sort of the big view. At the end of the Cold War 20 years ago, we were spending on average 6% of our GDP every year on our defenses, 6%. Okay? In the span of 20 years, this year, we're down to 3% of our GDP being spent on defense. So we have cut in half the amount of our national wealth that we have devoted to our defenses. Okay? I don't think you can find another major part of the federal budget where you have this kind of cut. So that's point number one. Point number two is if you look at the defense budget, you see several, I think, important things. One is 40 years ago this year, we made a social choice to adopt a volunteer military. And we never really fully paid the price of that choice until after 9/11, when we engaged in a protracted conflict in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. In order to recruit and retain sufficient numbers of service members to conduct those operations, we've had to increase personnel spending by over 50% after inflation since 9/11. So that's a dramatic increase. On top of that, the Obama administration has set forth a revised defense plan which looks to cut nearly $500 billion out of our defenses over the next 10 years. So what do you get? You get a shrinking defense pie, number one. Number two, within that shrinking pie, you get an expanded slice for personnel costs. What does that mean? That means in the coming years, we're going to see a lot less funding for training, a lot less funding for maintaining our equipment, and a lot less money for replacing old and worn out equipment. I've been to this movie before. This is the equation for a hollow military. This is the equation for a military that gradually loses its effectiveness and capability. Now, how will our enemies react to this? Is this a gift to them? I don't know. I'm not privy to their thoughts. What I can tell you is that the silence is deafening. And as Napoleon once said, when your enemy is in the middle of making a great mistake, don't interrupt him. So that you have this particular situation. Now, some people will say, well, gee, we're pulling out of Afghanistan, we're out of Iraq, let's reduce defense spending. After all, the threat is diminishing. Well, first of all, our operations in those conflicts were funded by something called OCO, the Overseas Contingency Operation Budget. And those budgets are coming down and will go down to zero. But the base defense budget, typically when you draw down that budget, that is when the threat is declining. And as Robert Rosencrantz mentioned, we're in a situation right now where the threat is not declining. He had a pretty good short list. There's a longer list we can go through. John mentioned that we brought together 4 think tanks, from the moderate liberal to the moderate conservative, a few weeks ago to look at the sequestration cuts. And these are cuts, let's cut another $500 billion out of defense over the next decade. Despite the fact that there's a fair part of the political spectrum that was covered, there were two conclusions that the 4 think tanks agreed upon. The first is that cuts of the magnitude that are discussed and put forth in sequestration would be a disaster in terms of our military readiness and capability. Second is a belief, again, all four think tanks, a belief that the dangers to our security, the dangers to our economic well-being are increasing over time. When we've cut our budget since the end of World War II in the past, it's been when the threat's been declining, not when the threat's been increasing. So to sum up, those who advocate further cuts to our defenses as a way to put the fear of God into our enemies kind of remind me of what the Duke of Wellington once said about his own troops. He said, I don't know if they scare the enemy, but by God, these people scare the hell out of me. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew Krepinevich. Our motion is cutting the Pentagon's budget is a gift to our enemies, and here to speak against the motion, Benjamin Friedman. He is a research fellow in defense and homeland security studies at the Cato Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, Ben Friedman.
Thanks. Andrew, it's a great honor to be able to frighten you. That's one of my more impressive achievements. I think if we cut the Pentagon budget to zero, sure, that would be a gift. But the cuts that are on offer in our political system are a different story. The president right now wants to spend roughly $550 billion on defense, including that's national defense budget function 050. That doesn't include the wars. Under sequestration, under the cap that we have in place for this coming fiscal year, that would have to come down about $50 billion. And over the decade, we'd spend 4.8 trillion on defense instead of 5.3 trillion. We'd still account for over 40% of global military spending and spend more than we did at most points during the Cold War in real terms. GDP measures, the percentage of GDP measures what percentage of wealth we're spending, but of course our economy has been growing that whole time. We're 7 times wealthier than we were in 1950 or something like that. So if that amount of spending is a gift to our enemies, it's sort of a crappy first night of Hanukkah type gift like sweat socks or toothpaste. I think our enemies are too far behind for it to matter much. They're sort of small potatoes, historically speaking, especially when you consider our wealth, our technological prowess, and our geographic advantage, these oceans around us and our weak and peaceful neighbors. Our biggest threat right now, according to pretty much everyone, is a scattered and increasingly pathetic remnant of the al-Qaeda terrorist movement that it's failed to do much since 2001 except scare us into terrorizing ourselves. And even if you don't buy that take, you ought to recognize that aggressive counterterrorism operations with drones, with special operations forces, intelligence galore, requires only a tiny fraction of our military budget. And our state enemies, North Korea, Iran, Syria, they're brutal regimes that pose little threat here. They lack the capacity to conquer their neighbors, let alone come over here and harm us. Russia, if you want to consider that an enemy, of course has a lot of nuclear weapons, but with the dwindling population, a rusty conventional military dependent on an economy that's about equal to the Iberian Peninsulas, its days of threatening Western Europe are long gone, whatever we do. Now, China's a bigger issue. I'm sure will come up a bunch here, but they spend about a third of what we do on defense, on their military, and most of that goes to ground forces that are largely irrelevant to the naval and air war that we might have with them, if we had any war. We have 11 carriers. They have one that they practice on. Their much heralded anti-ship ballistic missile capability, which is supposed to be a threat to our ships, at the moment remains quite vulnerable to various countermeasures that we have. And I think maintaining that edge is not a problem of absolute resources. More important, China is a trading partner, not really an enemy, that we have no good reason to threaten unless you're eager to fight a war over disputed Pacific rocks, which I'm not. I think we should hedge against China's rise, not by surrounding it with our forces, which likely encourages its military buildup, but by staying rich and avoiding debt and keeping a technological edge to allow a buildup later if need be. I think the real question when it comes to military spending is what's best, not for our enemies or worse for our enemies, but what's best for us. And I think what we want is the cheapest possible military that can defend our shores, that can keep trade routes open in times of duress, and fulfill the balancing function that long guided British and then U.S. military policy for a long time. That is to prevent a big rival from emerging overseas that can conquer our friends and threaten us. And I think we can do that quite easily with very little overseas military presence right now. What the other side wants from our military is global dominance, which I think is not really possible. They'll say that current or greater spending is necessary to our military strategy, which is primacy, which is to be the sort of globe-girdling policeman, and that strategy is necessary to global stability. And I think both parts of that statement are wrong. First, we could do essentially what we do in the world now in terms of our alliances, naval patrols, bases, at a substantially cheaper cost. I think you could trim at least $50 billion off the defense budget and do all the stuff we do now. And I can't explain the details of how you get there, but a good place to start, if you're interested, is Dr. Krepinevich's Foreign Affairs article from, I think it was February this year, that says, well, shift a bunch of money out of the Army into the Navy. I think that's a good idea. I think you could also look at the joint letter that a number of think tanks signed on to that had a bunch of efficiency savings, including another background and personnel cost reform. We're not destined to spend what we do right now on personnel, and both my opponents signed that letter. Second, global peace and trade, I think, would be fine if we adopted a more restrained strategy, and we'd be safer for it by staying out of avoidable trouble. This argument sort of reinterprets the Cold War. We didn't get into the Cold War to make global stability or secure the international system. We were defending Europe against communism. We were defending some of our Asian allies against communism. And then our allies got rich, and we invented a new rationale for what we're doing. And sort of the new story is we agreed to defend them, and they agreed to let us. But I think our allies now have the capacity to defend themselves, and we ought to let them do that. And I think what we'll see if that happens is a stable balance of power in Asia, and in Europe there's basically no threat, so that's not a problem. But we'll see a stable balance of power. And as for trade routes, we don't really defend them now. There's very little military protection of them.
And Friedman, I'm sorry, your time is up.
Yep, I'll finish right up.
No, I'm sorry. That's the rule. I got it.
Oh, okay.
You can bring it up in the middle of the debate.
Okay.
All right, thanks very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Ben Friedman. And here's a reminder of what's going on. We are halfway through the opening round of this Intelligence Squared U.S. debate. I'm John Donvan. We have 4 debaters, 2 teams of 2, fighting it out over this motion: cutting the Pentagon's budget is a gift to our enemies. You have heard 2 of the opening statements, and now on to the third. Debating in support of the motion that cutting the Pentagon's budget is a gift to our enemies, Thomas Donnelly. He is co-director of the Marilyn Ware Center for Security Studies and resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Donnelly.
Thanks, John. I'd like to echo the thanks that my colleagues gave to the IQ people and the McCain Institute people. I'd like to thank the audience, too. It's a beautiful day, and coming in here and talking about defense budgets is perhaps not the way I would spend my afternoon if I had a choice. The smartest soldier of all time said that everything in war is simple, but the simple things are difficult. And this debate is a perfect example of why that's true. We're really talking about 3 things and how they relate to one another. We talk about money and budgets, and you've already heard a fog of numbers being thrown out and slices of pies being alluded to. It's a lot of money that we're talking about. But I would ask you to consider defense spending in a different way, as not just a cost proposition, but a value proposition. Are we getting a return on our investment that's worth it as taxpayers and Americans? I would say absolutely. Andy says for 3 cents out of our dollar, whether we're getting the global dominance that Ben suggested or merely treading water, we have a remarkably peaceful world. There hasn't been a great power war since the end of World War II, and personally, I would like to keep it that way. That's something that I can't quite put a price tag on. And what we're spending now is certainly affordable. So ask yourselves, is it worth the money we spend? That's the way I would ask you guys to consider the proposition. Second part is even more unpleasant, the idea that we have enemies in the world. We don't like to think that as Americans. We wished everybody loved us, and we try to love them. But it is a dangerous world. Ben sort of downplayed all the threats that are out there. We're going to have a discussion about that. Reasonable people can differ over who's the biggest threat and what the size of the danger is. But again, do you want to take a risk with this? If we're much stronger than our enemies, is that a bad thing? They're not all enemies. They're people who are sitting on the fence one way or the other. I would prefer to live in a world where we have fewer enemies and the ones that might be enemies don't want to mess with us. And again, I think that's a great value proposition. The final part of the proposition is whether it's a gift to our enemies or not. As Andy said, we don't know whether it's a gift, but it is already, we can tell, a dangerous temptation. That's what we see in the Middle East today. As we have come home from Iraq and are about to depart from Afghanistan, we see in Syria a war that's metastasizing. That's like the Iraq civil war that we saw in 2006, only on steroids, much more so. So, is that a gift to our enemies? I don't know. It's not a gift. Going to war is never a gift. Our withdrawal from the world after World War I was not a gift to Germany and Japan, but it was a dangerous temptation to Adolf Hitler and to the Imperial Japanese. World War II was a gift to nobody, but it was a necessary thing to do, and a temptation to evil people in the world, and there are evil people in the world. So we'll work through all these questions. I like it that we have allies. They provide the battlefield. That you can't put a price tag on that. It's better to fight over there than it is here at home. So having America be powerful in the world, be engaged in the world, out there in the world, has created a world that's more prosperous, that's safer, and for Americans, possibly the most important point, is freer than it has ever been in human history. We should not give that up. You don't win prizes in war for being the guy who does it in the cheapest way. There are no style points. The outcome is what matters, and that's what we should be focusing on when we weigh this proposition. Is it a gift to our enemies? No. But it's a temptation to them, it's a risk for our friends, and it could be a real danger to us. We send very few Americans. The world is so peaceful, and our military is so good that it only takes less than 1% of us to maintain the peace. I think that's a priceless investment almost. Vote for us.
Thank you, Tom Donnelly. Our motion is cutting the Pentagon's budget is a gift to our enemies, and our final debater who will speak against the motion is Corey Shockey. She is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. She was a senior foreign policy advisor to the McCain-Palin campaign and has served in the State Department and on the National Security Council. Ladies and gentlemen, Corey Shockey.
So I agree with everything Tom Donnelly just said. And I think you can still agree with Ben and me that cutting defense spending is not a gift to our enemies without compromising anything Tom just said. And let me try and walk you through why I think that's so. First, as most of you probably know, 31 cents of every dollar the United States government spends, it borrows. We may only spend 3% of it on defense, but 31% of it we have to borrow. Our national debt, the extent to which our spending is outpacing our revenue, that's the gift to America's enemies. We actually really need to bring our spending into alignment with our revenue. And the defense budget has doubled since 2001. The sequestration, the means by which we are further reducing it, is damaging, but the reduction in the top line, the overall level of spending, is manageable while maintaining a strong national defense, while retaining allies, while retaining the value proposition, and while frightening our enemies. The United States constitutes, our own defense budget is 40% of global defense spending. 40%, all by itself. There are 21 aircraft carriers in the fleets of the world's navies. 11 of those are in our Navy. American dominance in the military realm is overwhelming. Of all of the places you could cut spending, in fact, the margin for error in national defense is enormous. As Tom said, the value proposition that the American military provides. We can do things that other militaries cannot do. And that drives our enemies to radical asymmetric strategies. It drives them to terrorism, it drives them to cyber warfare, it drives them to things because they know they couldn't actually fight the American army and defeat it. It drives them to strategies of trying to erode our national will to fight the war, because if we fight it, we're going to win it. In regard to the threat from China, China is rising. And we're smart to hedge against a rising China. But I would encourage you to remember that one of the most important strategic variables, one of the most important advantages you can have is time. And we actually have a lot of time to figure out how to deal with a rising China. And the American military is one of many means for managing that rise, and one in which we have a strong advantage. A second thing I'd like to ask you to consider is I agree with Tom about the value proposition. The American military is extraordinarily good at what it does. That does not mean that the money that we spend on our defense, we spend well, right? The Defense Department, in truth, actually doesn't know if we have enough money to spend on American defense because they actually cannot pass an audit that every American business has to pass. DoD told Congress they won't be able to pass an audit until 2017. Given that the budget has doubled in the last 10 years, and DoD cannot account for the money, that suggests to me that there are reasonable places in the budget from which we could wring greater effectiveness in our spending. The American military is terrific at the effectiveness of warfighting. We are not cost effective. We are not particularly efficient at how we do it. And I would offer you the testimony of General Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who said that if we forced ourselves to think, we could probably do this with less resources. He also said that because budgets have essentially been unconstrained for the last 10 years, the American military's gotten into a lot of bad habits. As Admiral Mullen, General Dempsey's predecessor, said, we have raised a generation of military leaders who don't know how to budget because they've never had to do it. Let me just point out to you some of the cost drivers of how expensive American defense is. GAO determined last year that we wasted $74 billion in the year 2012 because of the procurement process, because of what Senator McCain has described as the military-industrial congressional complex. The Pentagon's determined we have 20% more bases and facilities than we need, and Congress will not permit them to close it. The Pentagon has tried to ramp down the expansion of the personnel accounts, military raises, housing funding, pensions, and Congress won't do it. So even the Pentagon understands there are resources to be saved here. In fact, the position that we are in is that we have the world's finest military, and that all-volunteer force is becoming unaffordable. We have to better constrain the costs of our defense. And even within national security, there are things that need money even more than the American military, right? If you look at why we are not more decisively winning the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the wars we have fought in the last 10 years, the reason is we're underfunding diplomacy, development, other things we need to spend our money on.
Thank you, Terry Shockey. And that concludes round one of this Intelligence Squared U.S. debate in partnership with the McCain Institute for International Leadership.